This is a continuation of the conversation about the Native people's response to American governance that happened right after the Revolutionary War. So where we left off was talking about Indian diplomacy and what it looked like now that the United States had taken shape. So under this new diplomacy, as I mentioned previously, Indian nations were starting to sell off land, where one member of the tribe would sign a treaty, and it would mean that the whole tribe would lose their land. We also see things like what happened at Fort Finney, where Shawnee go to Fort Finney in order to negotiate with Americans for a treaty. And what happens is there's no gift-giving, there's no diplomacy, there is rather intimidation tactics, where Indian people see Indian prisoners, being killed before their eyes. So this Indian diplomacy happens within the framework of this new government that's being set up. So under the Declaration of Independence, what we see is kind of this idea take shape, where the government as a whole starts to label Indian people, which we had seen before, as savages. And we also see a transition, which is a huge transition, where the United States as a whole believes it is their duty to civilize Indian people now that they are within the confines of their new land. So, much like the British, there is a belief that only the federal government can make treaties with Indian tribes, so there is some recognition that Indian tribes have some rights and are acting as owners of land. However, it is the decision of the United States to put their Indian department or their Indian affairs within the War Department. So we can see, although they have decided to act with government-to-government relationships in terms of signing treaty and ceding land, the way that they're going to go about that could be categorized in a different way, that they're going to do it by force, perhaps, because they've chosen to place the Indian Affairs Department within the War Department. So in addition to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, we have a couple of laws that are passed, and these laws relate to the way that not only treaties are going to be taken care of, but also how trade is going to be conducted with Indian people. So we see the passage of two laws, or two acts, one ordinance, that's passed, one in 1787, which is the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance is one of the first things that's passed in terms of how we're going to address relations with Indian people. So within that ordinance, what the U.S. government says is that we're going to act with good faith, and that land is not going to be taken without the approval of Congress. So whenever a treaty is made, it has to be approved by Congress. The other trade act that's passed is the one passed in 1790, the Trade and Intercourse Act. So the Trade and Intercourse Act is passed because in addition to negotiating for land, the other thing that happens with Indian people during this time is trade. So the federal government this time says that the only people who should be trading with Indian people, in order for us to be able to regulate that, are licensed traders. And once again, there is the federal government coming down and saying that there can't be any transfer of land within the Trade and Intercourse Act, so only trade goods. We have to have approval by Congress in order to cede any Indian land. So at the end of this time period, and we're really just seeing the very beginning of U.S. governance or American governance from that transition from British governments, we see that there is competition for power. So there is not certainly a recognition that the federal government, much like the British government, is the one in power. There is really a vying for power. There's a lot of land available. So as we end with this time period, what we see is that there's going to be conflict. There's competition for power, for land, for rights among settlers, so people coming in who want land, Indigenous people who want to keep their land and keep their people safe, the federal government who says they are the one who has control over treaty rights, and then finally we have a conflict between the federal government and state governments in terms of control and power of the land. There becomes a large question very quick about who should have that power, who should have the right to negotiate, what should that look like, and how are we going to control that negotiation.